I'm going to take you back a little bit, take you forward, take you backward. My grandfather liked to say, remember where you came from, don't get above your raising, that kind of thing. You've all heard things like that. I think David, before it's all over with, definitely is elevated, we could say, right? There's a passage of scripture that we'll touch upon in the weeks to come, God willing, where David recognizes and he is preparing for the temple, and he is describing, he's literally preparing for the temple, and he marvels at how God has taken him from the sheep cotes, which is where they kept the sheep. He took me out of the pen where he kept the sheep. He elevated me to be king. Elevated me to be king. I like a show of hands. Who would like to take somebody out of the sheep pen and make them president? I definitely would like to take somebody out of the sheep pen and make them president. I think the qualifications to be a shepherd are better than the qualifications to be pretty much anything else, to lead people. It requires humility, it requires hard work, it requires self-sacrifice. And frankly, leading sheep is sadly a lot like leading people. They don't go where you want them to go, when you want them to go there, or when you think they should go, they don't go the way you want. If you ever watch a shepherd dog, you imagine they must sleep really well at night because they move constantly. And sometimes they like bite at the feet of the sheep to make them go where they want to go. And sometimes God has to shepherd us. Jesus is described as the great shepherd and bishop of our souls. Sometimes he has to nip at our feet, has to bite us to get us to go where we are supposed to go at times. And I'm afraid our country may be in such a time as that. God is literally biting the feet of the church. And I hope we're paying attention. And anyway, but David is described as a shepherd, and we know him as a shepherd. And so it says in 1 Samuel chapter 24, we know that in the past chapter, Saul had left to go fight the Philistines, and David left from where he was at in the rock of escape where he was to then flee to continue his flight. And here he goes from one place to another, and here it says, behold, it says, it came to pass when Saul was returned from following the Philistines that it was told him, saying, behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. And I showed you this same image last week, if you can see it, of this, what is referred to as David's Falls. This is one of the few freshwater oases anywhere near the Dead Sea, because of course it is a great salt sea. It's terribly salty, poisonously salty, and completely unfit to drink. And so a lot of the water is polluted. It's like leached into the groundwater. And so this is a very, very special place. And it's considered one of the highlights of Israel. And I kind of wish I had gotten to go. Did you guys see this whenever you went? I wish we had gotten to go when I went years ago, because it's considered a real highlight and a real beautiful, beautiful place in Israel. And he's there, and it's one of the rare green places in a relatively rocky place. But he says David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. It says, then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats. And he came to the sheepcotes by the way, where was a cave. And Saul went in to cover his feet. And David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. And the men of David said unto him, behold, the day of which the Lord said unto thee, behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thine hand, that thou mayest do to him as it seemed good unto thee. Then David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privily. And it came to pass that David's heart smote him, because he had cut off Saul's skirt. And he said unto his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth mine hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. What humility. What humility you see in David. His men are effectively egging him on. They're like, look, you can do whatever you want. I'm sure there were many among them like, just go ahead and do Israel a favor and kill him. But David did not kill him, of course. He cuts off the skirt of his robe. Now, Saul must have been really, really, really tired. Because this is not the kind of thing you just come and like take a ribbon off of his jacket. I mean, he's got to sit here, and it's not like he's got like the sharpest razor scissors, right? I mean, he's got to take a few minutes. You can imagine the moments, the seconds are just eking by as he is cutting away this skirt from his robe. And all the while, Saul is snoring away. It says that Saul went in to cover his feet. Now, if you're not familiar with that phrase, it's found a couple of times in the Bible, and this is one of them. One is described here clearly, and there are other places where it says that a man covered his feet. I don't know about you, but when I go to bed at night, I'll lay outside the covers for a bit until actually I get too cool. I try to cool. I cannot sleep if I'm hot. But then my body, my legs and my torso, it gets cool enough. And then what do? I cover my feet because it's time to rest. So I could sympathize. I wondered why this, I thought about it. I was like, why this phrase? Why not the rest of him? I mean, what about his feet? And why does his feet have to be covered? It is definitely a position of repose, however. I mean, if you cover your feet, you're not going to run, right? You can do a lot of things to warm up. But if you cover your feet, you're pretty much committed to the act of resting. But I don't want to focus too much on that, but I want to think about where they are and where Saul has been brought by God's providence and where David is hiding. He is hiding, it says, upon the rocks of the wild goats. And here he came to the sheepcotes. That is, Saul came to the sheepcotes, and David's already there. And Saul doesn't know it. He's walking right into the cave where David is hiding. Just think about the providence, the God's will coming to pass in this very moment. They have been brought together for this exact moment. I've pointed this out many times. Jesus never met somebody he didn't know. Now, they met him and they didn't know him. But Jesus never met a person he was not familiar with. And every encounter he ever had was not an accident. Every single encounter was planned. He knew it was coming. The providence of God is all-encompassing. God knows what everything's going to happen, and nothing is going to happen that God does not already know how it's going to play out. Whether he controls the events or not, he knows exactly what will happen, and nothing will happen that is going to surprise him. And so he knew that he sent David into En-Gedi, and he let Saul know that David was in En-Gedi. And we see here that the two men have come together after all this time. We don't even know how much time has passed, but it has to have been weeks and perhaps months, maybe even some years. We don't really know, but some time has passed. And I'm sure it seemed like forever for both men because of the emotional agony of it all. But it came to the sheepcotes. Well, that's where David was taken from. Where did David go back to? Where does David flee to? He flees to the rocks, yes, but he flees to what's familiar to him, the sheepcote. And I imagine that among the shepherds, David was well favored. I mean, he's a champion. He's one of their own, right? That's why people like leaders that come from among their ranks. You get in the army, in the military service, you get a special ribbon if you've come from enlisted up to an officer. And it's a highly regarded ribbon, apparently. because your troops, they go look at you and go, oh, he was like one of us once. She went through the same aggravation that I went through, right? She went through the same training that I went through. She had to work her way up. He had to learn in the same way I did. He went through the same training that I did. He served in the trenches like I did, whatever it is. David remembered where he was from, and he is here hiding in the very place where the sheep would be kept. In the cave, whenever there's a storm or what have you, would keep them out of the rain and out of the storm. And David is taking his leave there. I don't know what a sheep cave smells like, but I'm imagining it's a lot like a barn. And I spent a lot of time around a barn when I was a boy. It's not where I want to sleep, I can just tell you. So Saul was tired, and David was trying to stay out of the way. But David says that when Saul comes in, covers his feet, David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. So they're somewhere inside that cave. It must have been pretty good size. And there are some big caves there along the Dead Sea, and they're deep. Like where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. That cave was so deep and so well hidden that it hadn't been discovered for thousands of years. So it's incredible the amount of caves and the types of caves that you'll find. But the men, of course, encourage him to do with him as it seems good in his sight. And what does seem good in his sight at that moment? David's most desperate act here is not to hurt the man, but what? To take a token. And you're going to see why he does this in a moment. It's wonderful. But he feels ashamed for having done it. Even though certainly many people would say he would be justified in killing him. It would be, in some ways, you might call it even a mercy killing. Some people might say. But David's reaction tells you everything you need to know about David's humility. And that is, he's like, Lord forbid that I should do this thing to who? My master. So he still views him as his master, though he's been so abused and so misused by him. He still refers to him here as Master, the Lord's anointed, the chosen one of God. And he feels ashamed that he would in any way stretch forth his hand against him. That's the kind of humility we should have. That's the kind of humility Jesus has in an even greater amount. But remember the sheepcoats. Remember where God drug you out of. Remember where, and I'm not going to say, didn't invite you out of it. He drug you out of it. He pulled you out of it. It's important to remember what we're made of and who made us. The Lord's anointed. Why would he refer to him in such a way? Well, you're going to see just how elevated David thinks of this notion. So we sometimes don't think about this, right? I mean, our presidents and our judges and our other officials, they take an oath of office. And we just like blow right past it. It's just a matter of course. But they swear before God and men to uphold the Constitution and other things for the good of our country, for the fellow good of our people. And so, for instance, what's going on in the streets and the cities of America right now, people are in protest because they feel that some people have violated that trust. Right? You can take issue with the way they're protesting, no doubt, but any violation of a public trust is just that, is a violation of the public trust. And people are understandably upset. And David holds the anointment of God, of his leadership upon a man, sacred. He holds it sacred. And because he holds it sacred, he holds Saul in a sacred way. Even though Saul, frankly, does not deserve to be held in a sacred way. Well, I mean, honestly, he's been terrible to him and terrible for the country. And God has already chosen David, and David is his chosen successor, and yet he still does so. But in doing so, he shows what he's really made of, what David is truly made of. So David stayed his servants with these words, because I can imagine they're like, that's all you're going to do? You just imagine them whispering in the sides of the cave. Really? All you're going to do is cut off his skirt? Come on. When are you going to get this opportunity again? God has brought him to you. Don't waste this opportunity. You ever heard anybody say something? You don't waste this opportunity, right? And when you know that you should forego. David stayed his servants with these words and suffered them not to rise against Saul. But Saul rose up out of the cave and went on his way. David also arose afterward and went out of the cave and cried after Saul, saying, "My Lord, the king." What an acknowledgement. And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed himself. And David said to Saul, "Wherefore hearest thou men's words, saying, Behold, David seeketh thy hurt? Behold, this day thine eyes have seen how that the Lord hath delivered thee today into mine hand in the cave, and some bade me kill thee. But mine eye spared thee, and I said, I will not put forth mine hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed." We know David could kill a man. I mean, he'd done it many times. The power that God put into David's hands and the way in which David did it shows the work of God in the man's heart. But he asked the great question in verse 9. Where are you hearing this from? Who is telling you that David wants to hurt you? Why are you listening to them? You can imagine he's got the skirt in his hand, right? And he's holding it. It would be distinct. It's the king's robe. It would have been different than other men's. And he's had but to look down and go, oh, wait, that's why my knees are cold. This is a cave. This image that you see is a cave in this part of the world, in Gedi. It was a cave not unlike this one. Big hollowed out part of the earth created by God. And you know, when God was putting forth the effort to create the world and create all the mountains and the seas and all the great wonders of nature that we see, including this cave and the cave where David and Saul lived out this scene, he knew it was going to happen. He was making the place. Remember how Jesus said he's going to go forward and he's going to prepare a place for us? Just think about that. He's literally preparing a place. God dug out this hole in this rock, knowing that David and Saul, whenever our children were being born, when Orion was being born, our oldest child, we prepared his room for him, knowing that he was coming. We put the furniture in it and so forth. And he came early, so the crib wasn't put together whenever he was born. I had to run home and finish a few things before Michelle came home. We got clothes for him and all kinds of things. When we prepare, God is preparing in a much more spectacular way. And he's been preparing for all time. Look what happens next. This is one of the most amazing events. David goes on to say in verse 11 of 1 Samuel 24, "Moreover, my father, see, yea, the skirt of thy robe in my hand." Said he was holding his hand. "For in that I cut off the skirt of thy robe and kill thee not. Know thou and see, there is neither evil nor transgression in mine hand, and I have not sinned against thee. Yet thou huntest my soul to take it. The Lord judge between me and thee, and the Lord avenge me of thee. But mine hand shall not be upon thee." You kill me, but I'm not going to kill you. I'm not going to do it. As saith the proverb of the ancients, wickedness proceedeth from the wicked, but mine hand shall not be upon thee. After whom is the king of Israel come out? After whom doth thou pursue? After a dead dog, after a flea. The Lord therefore be judge, and judge between me and thee, and see and plead my cause, and deliver me out of thine hand. Somewhere close by, Saul had how many men? 3,000 chosen men of all Israel. These are chosen men, which is to say, these are the best he could find. These are men selected for the purpose and dedicated to the purpose. They're all like, yeah, we'll go after David, sure. He's a traitor, we want him. I mean, you can always find people that are willing to do violence. You don't have to look far to find people who are willing to do violence. That's why in schools, I never ever understood the phenomenon that when a fight broke out, there was always a crowd to watch it. It sickened me from the youngest age I ever saw it, and I only saw it maybe 2 or 3 times. After whom is the king come out? And then David says he's basically a dead dog. That he, David, is like a dead dog. I'm not worth this effort. Nowhere near am I worth this kind of effort. But he says, I'll let the Lord judge between you and me. I'm not doing anything. I'm not going to raise my hand against you. And in this same place, this same beautiful place of En-Gedi, in this cave, Saul standing there looking back at David, he has a moment. I think David was brought back to the sheepcote, but I think Saul was the one who was really brought back to the sheepcote this day. Brought back to an humbler place, to remember where he came from, to remember where he took David from. And sometimes we need to be humbled. And I'll be honest with you, I don't like being humbled. It's not a very pleasant experience. But sometimes we have to be humbled. It said, it came to pass when David had made an end of speaking these words unto Saul, that Saul said, is this thy voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And he said to David, thou art more righteous than I. For thou hast rewarded me good, whereas I have rewarded thee evil. And thou hast showed this day how that thou hast dealt well with me. For as much as when the Lord had delivered me into thine hand, thou killedst me not. For if a man find his enemy, will he let him go well away? Wherefore the Lord reward thee good, for that thou hast done unto me this day. And now behold, I know well that thou shalt surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in thine hand. Swear now therefore unto me by the Lord, that thou wilt not cut off my seed after me, and that thou wilt not destroy my name out of my father's house. And David sware unto Saul, and Saul went home. But David and his men gat them up unto the hold. What an amazing event. This event tells me that no person is unreachable. They may seem completely, 5 minutes before he entered that cave, I would have said Saul was completely unreachable. And I would have told him also that David was the last person to be able to reach him, if it were possible to reach him. But yet it's David that turns out to be the vessel of God's work, because David was literally willing to die to do this. You know he was willing to die because he's right there in a cave. There's 3,000 men somewhere within practically earshot. All Saul probably had to do is call loudly for them, and they would have swarmed in that cave, and every one of them would have died. At least in any practical estimation of what would have happened. God could do anything he wants, but what God wanted was for Saul to know who was in control. He'd been saying for weeks that he kept claiming that David was in his hand. Oh, the Lord has put him in my hand. He's put him in my hand. And Randall rightly put it. He's like, that's just him talking. He doesn't have any right to say that. And maybe he's saying that for political reasons. Maybe he's saying that to drum up support for his cause among people who think they're believing by following Saul. But he acknowledges that David truly was given Saul into his hand by the Lord's providence. And what did he do? He showed humility. He showed restraint. He showed meekness. You know, there is an incredible strength in meekness. The ability to restrain oneself from action often takes far more power than to exercise one's power. To hold back is very difficult, especially when we feel that we've been unjustly treated, or that we feel someone we love has been unjustly treated. Michelle often points out that sometimes it is someone else's pain that we feel most justified in feeling righteous indignation about, right? Moms are the perfect example, right? If you ever pick on a mother's child, no matter how rotten that child might be, the mama always speaks up in their defense. And the more you persist, the more angry you're going to make her, and the more she's going to be apt to justify their actions, no matter how irrational, because she's their mama. She's built that way. She is wired that way, which is why when mothers don't behave that way, we find it really weird. Restraint. David has incredible restraint. Think about the restraint Jesus Christ had. He's the maker of heaven and earth. Every day on earth was an immense insult to him. He saw through every hypocrisy, and occasionally he let it out, like he did in Bible study this morning. He told the Pharisees what for. I mean, he told them as clear as that could possibly be expressed that they were absolute hypocrites, vipers. Ouch. But yet, in doing so, he showed them love because that's what they needed to hear. And some of them heard. Some of them heard. Thou art more righteous than I, because you've done me good, and I've done nothing but evil to you. Jesus, I showed you this image at the very beginning. I'll back it up. I should have picked it up earlier. In our call to worship, I read from Psalm 115, 1 through 5. David wrote this psalm. Look at verse 4. And remember, David is inquiring, Lord, who shall abide in thy tabernacle? Who shall dwell in thy holy hill? Who can be in your presence, God? That's what he's really saying. Who could really be in your presence? This is the person that walks uprightly, that does righteous things. He's not asking who can be saved, right? Anybody can be saved, but who gets to dwell in God's presence? That's what the Beatitudes are all about, right? Who can see God, right? The one that we learned this morning, the one that's pure in heart, that's been purged, purified. And in verse 4, he says, in whose eyes, this person, the one who dwells in the presence of God, their eyes, when they see the vile person, they condemn the vileness of it. They condemn it. But he honors them that fear the Lord. And look at that last part. He that sweareth to his own hurt and changeth not. What did David do? He said, I don't care what you do. The Lord judge between me and you. I'm not going to touch you. I'm not going to lay a finger on you. What did Jesus do when he stepped foot on this earth? Every moment, every second of every moment, he was saying constantly, I'm not going to kill them. I will not destroy them. I will show restraint. I will show them who God really is. They think they know who God is. They don't really have an idea. They don't understand. I will show restraint. And Jesus, he made an oath to the Father. He swore to his own hurt and did not change his course. At any point in time, Jesus said, you know, I'm out. I'm leaving. I'm moving to France. I don't know, something. I'm getting out. But he didn't. He didn't. He wouldn't. He swore to his own hurt. And because of that, Jesus has a place before God that is greater than any other and ever shall be. And so Peter wrote on this wise in 1 Peter chapter 4, for as much then as Christ hath suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind, for he that hath suffered in the flesh hath ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lust of men, but to the will of God. For the time past of our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles when we walked in lasciviousness, lusts, excess of wine, revelings, banquetings, and abominable idolatries, wherein they think it strange that ye run not with them in the excess of riot, speaking evil of you. Who shall give account to him that is ready to judge the quick and the dead? For this cause was the gospel preached also to them that are dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. But the end of all things is at hand. Be ye therefore sober and watch unto prayer. And above all, have fervent charity among yourselves. For charity, that is, the love of God, shall cover the multitude of sins. Use hospitality one to another without grudging. And listen close. As every man hath received the gift, even so minister the same to one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. You see, what David understood in that cave is that he had been given a gift. He'd been given the gift of this man's life in his hand. And what was he going to do with it? Sure, he could kill him. He could easily overpower him. He could make him disappear. Nobody might ever know. Somehow he just died in the woods. We don't know where he went. Or he could have taken him and cut off his head like he did Goliath and parade it for the people of Israel and be that kind of king. But he was a man after God's own heart. You want to know what God is like? God behaves like that. God shows restraint. He is the judge of the quick and the dead, and yet, even still, he sends forth messengers into the world to tell the people the good news and to get their act together. That's what John the Baptist is doing. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven at hand. In modern terms, we would say, get your act together. God is coming. As every man hath received the gift, even so minister the same one to another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. As recipients of the grace of God, we have a responsibility to minister that same grace in the world, to show the restraint that God showed, to show the wisdom that God showed in Jesus Christ, to show the wisdom and the love and the power every moment of every day. Is it a high calling? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It's the highest calling any human being has ever been called to, is to act like the Son of God. But that's what we've been called to. And praise the Lord that we have had the privilege to be called to that. We should set behind us all the things that we thought we enjoyed before, because they can't coexist. Brothers and sisters, this is the message I have for you today. I pray the Lord will need be take you back to the sheepcote to find comfort in what's familiar, and to be humbled and reminded of where we all come from, and by the grace of God, we've been raised.